Hello, everyone. I just want to check if you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hi, Zahra. How are you?
Hello, Rohit. Thank you so much. I'm good. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you so much.
Thank
I'm
you for
still
accepting
having
our
trouble
invitation.
in uploading my slides. I really don't know how to do it.
Do you want to share? Fatima is here, and she can definitely, if you can send it to her, she can maybe make it visible for
It's a
you.
very large file. It's a file of around 50 MB. That's a problem. So.
Okay, do you want to try and ping it to me on Teams? Teams do tend to take big files, and I can help you with the slide whenever you say next or next slide.
So how do I send it to you on Teams?
Just drag it onto the Teams chat. It could be my personal chat. It could be the chat of this meeting if you're happy to share your slides with everyone. Any way that is easier for you.
I'm very happy to share my slides with everyone. And I don't know why the camera is getting turned off again and again. I can't figure out. Okay, so what you're saying is I should go to chat. I'm really sorry. I don't know how to put it in, attach it, on chat. Can you guide me, please, Fatima?
Yes.
Usually when you drag the file, it works, or otherwise you can Is it too big for the email?
It's 50 MB. It's not going to go through on an email.
There will be a plus button on the left side near the chat. You can see from there you can add.
No, it's not working. I just did that. Let me try rejoining and see if it works. Give me a moment.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Mina.
Hi, Zahra.
So what I initially wanted to do anyway is to give Fatima and Tana a few minutes each to talk about the two research groups that are involved in organizing this talk today, the borderlines and the minds. So Rohit, take your time. We will go through with a few minutes of introducing the research talks, the research groups that organize this talk. So while you are figuring out how to either email or share your files on Teams chat, Fatima, can you go ahead introducing a bit and maybe talking about some upcoming events from the borderlines, and then Tana, we can do the same about minds. And then after that, I will do a brief introduction for our speaker today, and then we can go ahead with that.
Hello, everyone. This is Fatma, coordinator of Borderlines, an interdisciplinary research collective based at School of Business and Management, Queen Mary University of London. Oh, we all know that. Thank you very much for joining today's workshop. We were honestly so excited to see registrations coming from all over the world, especially from South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, which is just incredible. I'm also very excited to share that Borderlines has just recently launched a much awaited seminar series on AI, voice, and decolonial knowledge. The opening seminar will take place on 2nd December, and I will share the flyer with the registration links in the chat so that you can just register and join us. It's going to be a lovely session. Each session will have like 3 to 4 speakers from the field. And we are also thinking of adding some artistic elements. Probably some of the contributors will sing or read a poem. So there is lots you can look forward to. Can't wait to see some of you there. Thank you, everyone. And a big, big thank you to Rohit for agreeing to share your wonderful work and expertise with us. Thank you so much.
Fatima, before I forget, there's already a question about recording. Do we have a confirmed answer to that?
Yes, so we can do this both ways. First of all, we will upload the recording to our Borderlines YouTube channel, and the people who have registered us through Eventbrite, we will also send an email with the recording in it so that you can access it both ways.
Thank you so much. Tana, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you very much, Zahra. Thank you very much, Rohit, for accepting our invitation and for joining us today, and welcome everyone. For those of you who may not be familiar with Minds, we are the Marketing Insights and Digital Societies research group at Queen Mary. We are the main research group within the marketing department, and our members also have a very wide range of research interests. They do research on consumer behavior, consumer culture theory, digital marketing, digital economy, and so on. So lots of events that are matching these interests are coming up. This is one of our first events for this academic year that we co-organize with Borderline. So a big thank you to Fatima and to Meira for their support. And we have a few more events coming up, including one next week with the editor of the Journal of Marketing Education. So if anyone is interested, we have the event link on LinkedIn. And also, please just keep an eye on our LinkedIn page for more exciting events that are coming up this academic year. So this is just the start. So yes, thank you very much, Zahra. Thank you, Rohit, again, Fatima, and yeah, I look forward to the talk.
Thank you, Tana. Rohit, how's it going from your side?
Thank you so much. I don't think it's going to work, but I'm happy to talk about it if that's okay with the audience. You know, I'm just going to talk about what I had in terms of the content on my slides. I know it's not visually as appealing to see my face as opposed to some nice slides, but we'll try to anyway deal with this situation. So is it okay if I begin?
Absolutely. I was going to suggest, do you want to take a few minutes and maybe break your presentation into maybe 2 or different slides? So it's shorter and, I don't know, lighter for the email, while I give a quick introduction about you and your work. I mean, we can still sort of, spend a few more minutes figuring it out if that's easier to go through your presentation. It's up to you.
I'm okay. I'm just going to talk about it. You know, it might be a slightly shorter, but I'm happy to just talk about it, and then we can open the floor for questions and we can have a dialogue about this important issue, if that's all right with you.
This is absolutely all right with us. I'm just going to quickly say that for those of you marketing and consumer research, Rohit probably doesn't need an introduction. For those of you outside this field, I just briefly say that he's a professor of marketing and consumption at University of Birmingham. His research uses interpretive and ethnographic approaches to explore a variety of topics in our field. He's looked at corporate violence, even globalization, nationalism, poverty within consumer culture. What is essential about his work is that Rohit has given voice to what we call non-mainstream consumer cultures, global south consumer markets, and essentially challenges what is really fine-grained into our field and is dominant mainstream Western-centric assumptions. So for example, through post-colonial lens, that is this topic of his seminar today. He looks at how marginalized voices and consumers of cultures remain maybe peripheral or silenced. Without further ado, I can go on and on about your publications, about your journal publications, about your books, but the floor is yours. Also, let me know how you want us to manage the questions. Do you want this to be more of a dialogue as they appear, or you want the questions all at the end?
I'm happy to take the questions at the end if that's all right with you, because it gives me clean time to talk about some of the issues that I wish to talk about.
That's how we usually do it anyway. Thank you so much. Floor is yours. Let me know if there is anything. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zahra. Thank you, Fatima. Thank you, to the entire Borderlines team for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here. And I mean, we've gathered here to talk about such an important issue. And before I begin, I would like to express my solidarity with the people of Palestine. We can't be talking about colonial and post-colonial without acknowledging the genocide that is ongoing, and without expressing our solidarities with the people of Palestine. So let me now before I get into the specifics of what post-colonial means, what I want to do is to take you to colonial India. And what I want to do is to briefly talk about, what happened in 1918. Now, my plan was to show you the newspaper that was published on the 1st of October, 1918. And unfortunately, I can't share the visuals, but I'll try to describe what was there in the newspaper on this day. Now, the newspaper that I will be talking about was the Times of India, which was a leading daily of the Anglo-Indian establishment. It was a newspaper which was founded in 1838. It was originally known as the Bombay Times and the Journal of Commerce. Its more contemporary name, the Times of India, was given to it in 1861. It was a newspaper which was owned by Bennett Coleman and Company, which was a British joint stock company. The owner of the company, Thomas J. Bennett, was a Conservative Party member of Parliament. And its editor in the period that I'm talking about, which is 1918 in colonial India, was somebody called Herbert Stanley Reed, who went on after his term got over in 1924. He went on to become a Conservative Party member of Parliament. So this is the background. So now, what was going on in the newspaper? Now, as I said, I wish I could share the content of that day's newspaper, but I'll just describe to you. If you were to go through the newspaper of that day, it had 10 pages. And out of those 10 pages, 8 pages or 7 pages were devoted to classifieds, were devoted to advertisements. And on the inside of that newspaper, on page 8 in column 4, a very small column, a news appeared, which was, the headline of the news was, "Influenza Epidemic, Its Unchecked Progress." The column went on to state that the influenza epidemic continues daily to exact a heavy toll from the citizens of Bombay. Its progress since the second outbreak in the first week of September has been unchecked. Now, why is it that I'm pointing to this column? Why is it that I'm pointing to this column, which was, 2% of the total newspaper space on that day? And on the page on which it appeared, the first column was devoted to London letters. The second, third columns were devoted to commerce of India. And the sixth column was about current affairs. So it was buried inside a newspaper, almost completely inconsequential. But what is it that was extremely consequential that was unfolding around this time? Now, those of us who are aware of the history of this period will tell you that this is a period when the greatest medical holocaust in human history is unfolding, which is the Spanish flu or influenza of 1918. This is a medical holocaust because nearly 100 million people died across the globe. And out of this, the highest number of deaths happened in India. In the territories controlled by Britishers directly, 14 million Indians died. In the territories they ruled indirectly through princely states, another 4 million Indians died. So we have, in a short period of time, in that era, 1918, 18 million people dying in next to no time. Okay. And when I'm talking about the 1st of October, October first week is the peak of what we see mortality rates in the part where this newspaper was published, which is Bombay Presidency. So at the peak of this, what we see is a complete invisibilization of deaths of the natives. And this is not something which was not understood by the colonial regime. This is very well understood because if you look at British archives, if you look at they would, British government, colonial government would come out with a periodic report, which was called the Sanitary Commissioner's Report. In that report, they acknowledged that, and I quote from there, a widespread epidemic of a disease which was in no case directly fatal, occurred during March and April in certain parts of India. The second wave commenced in September and reached its maximum in October in the presidency. Which is this presidency? It's the Bombay presidency that we are talking about. The report goes on to state all rivers across India were clogged up with dead bodies. And that was the scale of those are the death rates that we are witnessing in this period of time. But if you were to look at the Times of India, it was as if it was a non-event. There's nothing which was happening which required attention. The Times of India, again, please, we have to remind ourselves, is a leading newspaper of the British establishment in the country. It systematically downplayed deaths. If you look at the newspaper, and I've systematically done an archival study, in this entire period from September to October to November to December, there's very little mention of what is actually going on. This is one part of it. So you completely deny the occurrence of such an event. There's no trace which is left. What else do we see in the kind of reporting that is happening? There's a certain signification practice that you see. A part of that signification practice is that the sovereign, the colonial ruler, is always projected as a benevolent actor. There's almost no accountability of the colonial state that you will see in these newspaper representations. If I quote David Arnold, famous British historian, who says, reflecting over 1918, he writes, nobody in government, it might be said, was particularly concerned about the 12 million deaths in 1918 and 19 because nobody in authority much cared or had the political will. And this is a British historian. This is not, somebody writing from the colony. So it's important to take note of that. Now, when we talk about 18 million people dying, who were primarily the victims? If you look at the death rates, and if you see this study done by David Hardiman, what you will see is that the death rates were significantly lower amongst Europeans and amongst high caste and high class Indians. Who was primarily dying? Low caste and underclasses. The death rates were 3 to 4 times higher amongst these groups. So in terms of the signification practices, what do we see here? You know, if you look at what Achille Mbembe, you know, this famous Cameroonian philosopher, writer, has to say, you know, if I quote him, he says that while British newspapers were expected to be pillars of its democratic ethos, in colonies, democracy's nocturnal face, news reporting was expected to establish the absolute sovereignty of the colonizer. And this is an important point for us to understand about what colonialism was and how its legacy continues in this post-colonial world. But coming back to 1918 and what we witnessed, there was another significant aspect of what was being signified in reporting, and it was about how people who were dying were actually primitive savages who were dying despite the best efforts of the colonial state. So if I read out from one of the reports, and this is very instructive, it says, the health department, it appears, are doing their utmost by means of health visitors and hand-billed advertising to help the poorer classes of people who are chief sufferers from the epidemic. But until the wave of infection plays itself out, there's no means of preventing its spread. And the prejudices of people are a severe handicap upon efforts to bring them under proper medical treatment, when one can hardly expect illiterate people to submit to irksome special measures they do not understand. So who's dying? People who are illiterate. Who's dying? People who have prejudices, people who are savages. You know, I'll very quickly read out from another report which appeared on the 23rd of October, 1918. Epidemics of influenza in European countries do give some warning, and people can take advantage of such facilities as Western cities provide and at once recognize the necessity of immediate action and relief. But here in Bombay, you all know how difficult it is to get the people to listen to any advice which is contrary to their way of thinking. Now, what does it tell you? It basically tells you that, you know, people in the West, Europeans, are enlightened, and when they are faced with such situations, they're able to respond in a rational manner. But what you see in Bombay and in a colony is just the opposite. These are primitive savages who do not have the ability to think about their own welfare, and hence they perish. It's a world of undesirables, as Bembe would say. Right? So what you see is, you know, there are two moments of signification here. One is the state is benevolent, and the other is that people who are dying or the colonized are savages. Now, there's another and third important aspect of what you see in 1918. While all this is going on, while there is a very systematic underreporting of the deaths and attention being paid to influenza, you have the newspapers are full of advertising, and you have more advertisements, on and about influenza drugs than they are about, what is actually going on in terms of the sufferings of the people. In fact, you have, ads which are, and ads which are, almost taking half a page of that newspaper, which invite people to visit opera houses, to go and enjoy hula hula Hawaiian dance. It's almost completely perverse in terms of what is being reported and how it's being reported and what is being represented in the newspaper. So this is one aspect of it, commercial interests, advertising money, which is extremely important. It shapes what gets reported and what doesn't get reported. Another facet of 1918 is that this is a period of a famine in the country. This is a period when the rainfall had failed. This is also a period that coincides with the diversion of food grain for the British war efforts. This is 1918, the First World War, and the food prices are extremely high. And the poor have very limited access to food. So who's dying? People who are primarily dying are the ones who are already made vulnerable because of absence of food. Right? So it tells you a little bit about, how consumption and consumers and markets were aligned in the colonial world. Okay. But is there any mention of that in the newspaper? There's almost no mention of it. There's little coverage of the price rise. There's almost no reporting on the commercial interests and who's making gains because of the trade that is happening. There's no accountability. And what I would like to add here, and this is important, that the traders who were making gains were not just Britishers. They were also elite Indians. So there was a certain elite class which was making money, while millions were dying. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that in order to understand colonial markets and colonial consumption, what we have to do is to pay attention to what Shail Bembe says is something called necropolitics. The idea of necropolitics is different from Michel Foucault's idea of biopolitics. While biopolitics is about, fostering a subject position in a way that we can ensure that that person becomes a productive asset in processes of accumulation. Necropolitics is just the opposite. It's about how we can confine people to the world of death. Right? And this is what we see unfolding in colonies. It's a site of where we see death worlds. Death worlds are a form of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to living conditions that confer upon them the status of the living dead. And who's a living dead? It's, as a rule, such death is something to which nobody feels any obligation to respond. Nobody even bears the slightest feeling of responsibility or justice towards this sort of life. This is how Bembe describes the living dead. So what you can see here is this 1918 is instructive because it helps us to understand how such a vast population was being confined to the death world and was treated as living dead. And it helps us to also understand then that colonialism was about not only necropolitics, it was also about necro-optics. Necro-optics meaning, what is represented, how it's represented, and who's held responsible for the events that we witnessed. Right. So again, the point that I'm trying to make is that, 1918 is very instructive in terms of helping us to understand the difference between how the colonizers governed themselves and how they governed the colonized. Okay, and this is something which is necessary for us to understand. This historicity is critical if we want to understand this moment, which is the post-colonial moment. Because what is the idea of post-colonial? The idea of post-colonial is to revisit and interrogate the colonial past. The idea is to examine the relationship of reciprocal antagonism and desire between the colonized and the colonizer, because we know that, yes, it gives rise to a certain level of antagonism between the colonizer and colonized, but it also, because of the scars, because of the subjectivity that is created because of the colonial experience, there's also a great desire amongst the colonized to be like the colonizer. So this is something which is important for us to understand in light of this experience of colonialism. Now, when we talk about post-colonial, we should also understand that it lends itself to two kinds of, it lends itself to the suffix of ity or ity in Latin, which means it indicates a state of condition. It also lends itself to another suffix, which is ism, which is about, which indicates a belief or a theory. So we have to understand post-colonial as post-coloniality and also as post-colonialism. Okay. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly, over the next few minutes, talk about, post-colonial theory as we understand it. Now, post-colonial theory or post-colonial studies, it's a framework for understanding the complex relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, which continues to shape the contemporary discourses of identity, race, politics, and culture. It's an error to treat post-colonial theory as some kind of a unified, discrete field. If you follow Timothy Brennan, he points out that it's more of a porous entity. It's it's an entity which is informed by writings in history, in literary studies, in anthropology, political theory, and so on and so forth. The important part here is that post-colonial theory is a theory of resistance. It's a theory of resistance to the mystifying amnesia of the colonial past. And it is precisely because of this reason that I started with 1918, which is something which has been forgotten in our accounts. There is a very mystifying amnesia about what happened in 1918. And this is something which has to be, always remembered when we talk about post-colonial theory, that it's about resistance and it's about reminding ourselves, in terms of what happened in colonial times. Now, when we look at the contemporary field of post-colonial theory, it's informed by a host of scholars. We have writings from Edward Said, Orientalism in 1978 was considered a landmark work, which in many ways is seen as the point of origin of post-colonial studies. We have writings, by Ranajit Guha, his famous writing, Dominance Without Hegemony, which plays a significant role in shaping post-colonial theory or post-colonial studies in South Asia. Before that, we have writings from Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mass, which is such a landmark work, which has informed post-colonial studies. We have writings by Homi Bhabha, The Location of Culture. I talked about Achille Mbembe's work on the post-colony and necropolitics, which are again very significant writings. Then we have writings from, Partha Chatterjee about, political theorist who informs us about the nature of post-colonial state. Gayatri Spivak, who writes about the important question of representation, who can the subaltern speak and who gets to represent this subaltern. Another important scholar is Ashish Nandi, who talks about, in his book, The Intimate Enemy, who talks about the psychology of being colonized. And then we have somebody, like Dipesh Chakrabarti, a historian who informs us about, how there are different histories to be understood in order to have, an assessment of the post-colonial condition. So we have a host of scholars, and in the limited time that I have, it's almost impossible to do justice to all these writings. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on some of the key aspects that we should be attending to, that we should be thinking about. Now, before the rise of post-colonial theory and before post-colonial scholars started paying attention to some of the facets of to the conditions of colonialism, there were two things which were fairly well understood about colonialism. A, that colonialism was a form of a spatial fix. Now, when I use the word spatial fix, I borrow from David Harvey, who describes spatial fix as a strategy to address economic challenges by creating geographical expansion through subordination of new spaces for investment and growth. So colonialism was about a spatial fix. It was about, reaching out to newer territories and exploiting those newer territories. When we talk about colonialism or when we talk about the spatial fix, there are broadly two types, right? One is what is known as your settler colonialism, something that we have witnessed in the Americas, in Australia, in parts of Africa, and then we have non-settler colonialism, which we see in different parts of Asia. So this is one facet which is fairly well understood. Another facet was what is known as the economic fix. That colonialism is about extraction of resources, it's about transfer of wealth. It leads to maldevelopment, underdevelopment, and dependent development. Somebody like, there's a fairly, famous writing now by Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik in the Indian context, which tells you that Britain drained nearly 45 trillion US dollars from India in the period from 1765 to 1938. And it led to the decline of India as we know it today, right? So these are some of the facets which are fairly well understood. Now, what is it that post-colonial theory was able to add? In addition to the spatial fix and the economic fix, post-colonial theory has paid a great deal of attention to the question of the racial fix. If you look at the writings of Edward Said, the whole idea of Orientalism, it tells you how an enormous system of rules was created, to regulate anything to be thought, written, or imagined about the Orient. And what was the whole idea? It was to create this discourse of Orientalism. It was to create a discourse of primitive, savage, and uncivilized, right? And this, in a way, was always racial. It was always about creating the other, and the other was always inferior. If you see the writings of Frantz Fanon, where he writes, very sharply in black skin, white masks, I slip into corners, I remain silent, I strive for anonymity, for invisibility. Or he later writes, my body was given back to me, sprawled out, distorted, recolored, clad in mourning in that white winter day. What you see are different facets of racialization. What you see are different aspects of how racialized colonial capitalism works. And when I use the term racialized colonial capitalism, I'm basically borrowing from Syed Hussain Alatas's writing on Southeast Asia, where he provides a wonderful account in his book, The Myth of the Lazy Native. He provides a wonderful account of how the myth of lazy native was created to further the colonial, processes of exploitation. So again, racialization was one of the key aspects that post-colonial theory has paid attention to. What else has it foregrounded? Another important fix that it has foregrounded is the idea of a temporal fix, where it has very systematically uncovered how the idea of modernity, how colonizing Europe has harnessed bourgeois time to conquer space. What we have witnessed is a very systematic attempt to treat the other, to treat the rest as a temporal laggard. As Partha Chatterjee writes, that colonized must come to believe in the unworthiness of their traditional customs and embrace the new forms of civilized and rational social order. This is central. This temporal fix was central to the idea of colonialism. It continues to be central to the post-colonial world that we live in. If you see discourses of emerging markets, if you see discourses of developing countries, what do we see here? What we see here is a permanent confinement of non-Westerners into the waiting rooms of history. We cannot co-eval with the West. The West will be developed, the West is modern, and the rest has to be perpetually in the mode of catching up. But we'll never have the privilege and the honor of being in the same time frame. So again, this is an important facet that post-colonial theory has foregrounded. Another important element, another key aspect of what we see in post-colonial theory is the question of the epistemic fix, or the knowledge fix. It creates a system of false universality. It creates a system that the knowledge being produced in the West is the only valid knowledge. It's a form of episticide. And what is very instructive is all these elements, what we see right now, have been in place for the last several hundred years. If I just take you back to colonial India and to take you back to a person called Thomas Macaulay, who was one of the key architects of the colonial education system, 19th century colonial education system in India, it's very instructive to see what he had to say about the state of Indians. So if I quote him here, he writes that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. And then he goes on to say that colonial education has to create, or British education has to create, a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. So this is essentially a project of not only intellectual imperialism, but it's also a project of creating a captive mind. If I borrow from Paulo Freire's writings, he would describe this as a banking concept of education, where, this privilege, this modern, this enlightened entity will come and deposit knowledge into the passive minds of the natives. So this is another important facet which has been foregrounded in post-colonial theory. And I'm sure all of us who write about the Global South, whether we write from our locations in the Global South or we write in our locations in the Global North, this is our lived experience, right? We can't be theorizing without acknowledging the writings and the canonical writings of the West, right? But the opposite is never true. People who write about the West in our field can be considered accomplished without ever acknowledging what is going on in the rest of the world. And Dipesh Chakrabarty calls this a system of asymmetric ignorance, where in order for people who write from the Global South, for those scholars to be considered accomplished, they have to not only know about their setting, but also they should also know everything about the West. And it's only through that totality that they can claim any position in the Western academy. But the opposite is not true. And in a way it tells you that this is not a relationship of equality. And it's an important point that is made by post-colonial theorists. Okay. Now I'm not getting into the domain of decolonization here and how we need to reject Western writings. I have something to say about it, but I'm happy to clarify if you have a question about it. But it's sufficient to say that it's a system of asymmetric ignorance. It's a system of great cognitive injustice that we see in terms of the knowledge, the project of knowledge production. Another important facet of post-colonial condition, which stems from our colonial histories, is the issue of political fix. Now, what is the idea of political fix? What I do is, in order to understand this, I lean on the writings of Mahmoud Mamdani. And I'm sure many of you would be aware of Zohran Mamdani and how well he has done in the recent, New York elections. So Mahmoud Mamdani is Zohran Mamdani's father. And he has a wonderful book called Citizen and Subject, which is based on his research on Uganda and South Africa. It's a book that came out, I think, in 1998. It's a wonderful piece of writing, which I strongly recommend to all of you. Now, what Mamdani does in this book is he talks about how, unlike Western states, which are more unified states, colonial states were always bifurcated states. Now, what is the idea of bifurcation here? The idea of bifurcation is that there was a population set, part of population that was allowed to create a civil society. Okay, a civil society is a society or is a social formation in which individuals have rights of citizenship. Okay, in settler colonies, what we saw, who was given the right, who was allowed to become a member of civil society? These were essentially Europeans. Okay, or some native elites. But your very vast colonized population was never allowed to become part of civil society. As part of this bifurcated state, they were always confined to what was known as, realm of customary power, which was outside the domain of civil society. In the realm of customary power, individuals were not citizens. They did not have rights. They were treated as subjects. Subjects who would be controlled through systems of violence. Okay, so what we see is a containerization of subject. That's one of the key aspects of colonial politics. Okay. And we see various forms of post-colonial continuities of this. If you read the writings of Partha Chatterjee, for instance, his famous book, The Politics of the Governed, he sharply points out how we see in various parts of the global South a small civil society and a much larger political society where individuals, subjects who don't have rights, jostle around, who negotiate with the state, their conditions of livelihood, their state of being, and their right to exist. Right. So this bifurcated state is another facet that we must be paying attention to in order to understand the condition of post-coloniality. Now, all these elements that I have talked about lead to what Frantz Fanon describes as the subject fix. What it does is it produces a degraded subject. Okay? Again, if I refer back to Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon very sharply points out that the colonized becomes a phobic object. It's a site of taboos, it's a site of horrors, it's a site of unclean things. Right? And what it leads to is, unlike the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, where the slave, in order to become free, can turn away from the master, because of this condition of this colonial experience, Fanon points out that the slave doesn't have the choice of turning away from the master, and the only way in which the slave can destabilize and attain a position of equal subjectivity is by becoming like the master. Right? So slave has a hypnotized gaze upon the master and is condemned to a derivative existence. Now, again, you will see many of these tendencies widely prevalent around us in the post-colonial world. If you see, the state of how consumers, for instance, in the global South, try to constantly copy. They try to constantly, emulate Western consumption and the Western elite. How it leads to what I have written about, the post-colonial politics of consumer respectability, which is constantly fraught with this desire to be like the colonized, but also knowing that you can never become like the colonized, never become like the colonizer. So this is another interesting aspect that we should be paying close attention to. So if I have to start summarizing, what is the whole project of post-colonial theory? The project of post-colonial theory is a project of historical self-understanding. Now, whether we are writing about markets or we're writing about consumer research or any other field in management theory, what we have to acknowledge is the historical experience and how that historical experience continues to shape what we see around us today. Because it has, cultural ramifications, psychological ramifications, epistemic ramifications, and political ramifications. As Bell Hooks sharply points out, from the post-colonial perspective, our struggle is also a struggle of memory against forgetting. It's important to undo mythologies and mythologies of, the cultural unsaid, Euronormativity. It also means that we should be challenging the canonical status that we have granted to some of the texts and how we need to challenge those texts and to include, voices from the rest of the world. That becomes a necessary part of this project then. Now, all that said, what I want to do over the next few minutes, and this is the last part of my talk today, I want to also talk about some of the limitations of post-colonial theory. As much as it has been useful, it has helped us to understand several things about our lived experiences today. There is a certain calypsology in post-colonial theory. Now, why do I use the word calypsology? If you read Homer's Odyssey, there's a goddess there, called Calypso, who basically who resides in this island of Ogygia, who masters in the ability to conceal and cover. And in this writing, and if you've read it, you know that Odysseus was confined to this island of Ogygia for 7 years and was concealed there. Okay. And it is from there that we understand the idea of calypso and calypsology, which is the whole notion of concealment. While it reveals certain things, but it also simultaneously conceals certain things. So what is the calypsology that we see in post-colonial theory? What we see is that while it is able to in a way uncover some of these fixes that we've talked about, it fails to account for certain important universals. Okay, and let me just get into those universals here. Now, if we understand law and legal theory, we know there are components of law. There are specific parts that make up a system, and in our context, in the context of post-colonial theory, there could be aspects of culture, identity, politics, and these issues are very well foregrounded in post-colonial theory. But these are all components, right? What it does is it often, while looking at these components, it overlooks some of the comprehending laws, which should help us to see the overall apparatus, which should help us to see the overall system. So it valorizes, it tends to valorize components over comprehending laws. And what is this important comprehending law that it tends to sometimes uh, overlook? That's the law of capitalism. What it does is it overlooks the fact that colonialism, European colonialism, cannot be understood without understanding its ties with capitalism, or without understanding that colonialism was a part of capitalism, right? And when I say this universal tendency or this universalization of capital, uh, I don't mean homogenization. You know, uh, the universalization of capitalism does not mean homogenization, because capital does not obliterate differences to universalize. It can very happily work with the unevenness that we see in the world, as long as it is able to contain and it is able to channelize these differences for the processes of accumulation. So again, we have to be careful. Post-colonial theory, while it talks about heterogeneity, while it talks about differences, what it does in the process is it overlooks a very significant universal, which is the universalization of capitalism. Right? There's another problematic universal that you will see in the calypsology that's prevalent in post-colonial theory, which is the treatment of the West as a universal. Now, this is highly problematic, and what I recommend to you is a writing by Vivek Chibber, his book Post-Colonial Theory and the Spectre of Capital, where Chibber sharply points out that, listen, to treat the entire West as a monolith is a serious error, because the West had its class-based hierarchies. There were groups that were oppressed. Think about the question of gender, think about underclasses, working people. There were all kinds of hierarchies, and there were all kinds of layers which existed in the West. And I'm talking about the colonial West. So, for instance, all we have to do is you read, Marx's Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 13. It tells you about the working conditions in the factories in England. That helps us to understand how, what we see as a monolithic West is a complete error of judgment. So the point I'm trying to make is, when we talk about people who were benefiting or people who were ruling, this is a certain class which was ruling. And hence we should never make the mistake of treating the West as a monolith. Okay. Similarly, the question of, the whole idea of multiple histories that Dipesh Chakrabarti talks about, this is not something which is unique to the non-West. Many will argue that this has been a historical trajectory, which it has been part of the Western experience as well. Or when Ranajit Guha talks about in his book Dominance Without Hegemony, and assumes that bourgeoisie in the colonized countries had a very different character from the bourgeoisie of the colonizer, this is an error of judgment, because there were broad similarities which existed. Okay, and I'm happy to clarify this issue further. But the point I'm making is that we cannot treat the West as a monolith. In a similar manner, we cannot treat the rest as a monolith either. We can't treat either the current state of post-colonial as a monolith or colonial as a monolith. Okay, there were various circuits of exploitation, oppression, hierarchies which existed, which were outside the field of colonial experience and which should be acknowledged. For instance, when I talk about India, the Indian caste system. Now, the caste system was not invented by the colonizers, right? And that's something to be understood. Similarly, when we talk about exploitation, the example that I gave you of 1918, who were the prime beneficiaries of it? Yes, there was British administration, colonial regime which was benefiting, but also there were Indian traders who were benefiting from the hoarding, from the diversion that was happening, from the increases in food grain prices. So there's always a class which is benefiting, which aligns with any system of exploitation and oppression, and that has to be foregrounded, that has to be understood if you want to get deeper insights into the post-colonial world that we live in. So again, I mean, if I just conclude, I would say that the project of post-colonial is a political project. It's about transforming systems of structural inequality. It's about critically analyzing capitalism and neocolonialism and imperialist systems that we see around us. It's about challenging oppressive hierarchies. And, in terms of the project of knowledge production, which we all are part of, it's a project that requires, if I can borrow from Mignolo, dissident scholarship. Dissident scholarship, which is not just, trying to reach across different disciplines, but which tries to be undisciplined in a certain way to challenge the canonical status of what we see, texts which are given to us. I'm happy to stop here. I wish I could share the slides, but I'm very happy to clarify any of the questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Rohit. It was an amazingly difficult task to summarize such a complicated topic. We now open the floor for questions. We already have some questions, but we have, as you mentioned, that's okay for everybody to have your slides. We will figure out a way to receive your slides at some point, and we can share it with everybody later on. And I'm sure that will be very helpful. Fariha, do you want to start?
Yes. Hi, Professor Rohit. I'm a PhD student at QMUL. I have two questions, and feel free to answer both or one. First is I do want to hear what you had to say about decoloniality because my work is on decoloniality. And secondly, as a younger academic at the beginning of a career, I'm seeing less critical work being done across schools, particularly business schools. Where do you think the future of criticality lies, especially in the context of a business school?
Faria, thank you so much for that question. Let me start with the second one. The future of critical theory. As I see it, and if I reflect over the last 30 years of close to 30 years of my own journey, I would say, if at all, there is more space for critical theory today in business schools than it was the case in the mid 90s or late 90s. And that's also because of the fact that if you see, and theory for me is always connected to the material world around you. Theory never, like a cloud hangs there. It always is connected to the world that we inhabit. And what is very evident if you look around, the rise of the far right, the kind of chaos that we see in the global order, not just 2008 crisis of capitalism, but the ongoing crisis of capitalism is very evident, it's very clear that the material world that we inhabit is in a state of crisis. Now, whether we are already, in a world of techno-feudalism, as Varoufakis would say, something has transformed, is a matter of a conversation, of a debate. But there's no doubt that we are in a state of change, as Gramsci would say, that it's an interregnum, and we see all kinds of morbid tendencies in this period of in-betweenness. And hence, critical theory will continue to play a very significant role. I don't see any way in which critical voices can be silenced. So that's my response to your second question. Now, the question of decoloniality is a more complex one. Uh, I have a strange relationship with some of the writings on decolonization. The first part, I understand the project of decolonization because the whole idea of post-colonial, many will argue, is an endless project. Where do we stop post? At some point, we need to stop post and say, this is it, and we'll start, the project of decolonization. Enough of the continuities of the colonial experience. And I'm very sympathetic to that. As a political project, I'm very sympathetic to that. So that part is fine. Now, what makes me very uncomfortable with some of the writings on decolonization is this very blanket rejection of anything that is written by Europeans. Any knowledge production of the West. Everything becomes Eurocentric. So Marx becomes Eurocentric, Foucault becomes Eurocentric, Bourdieu becomes Eurocentric. Everything is Eurocentric. And the only pure voice is the voice of the native then. Now, I find very serious limitations with this kind of a position. I think this is very counterproductive. It defeats the very idea of decolonization. Because colonialism, in my reading, was a feature of capitalism. And we have to constantly have a dialogue with some of the critical writings in Europe and critical writings in the West. And I'm not saying we blindly adopt everything or we blindly accept everything or we create an orthodoxy of a form. But we need to have those healthy dialogues. There's a difference between, if I can be, subtle about this point, there's a difference between being Eurocentric and Eurocentered. If you're writing in the 19th century, sitting in England, if you're writing about, how capital is, expanding and it is doing what it is doing, then your empirical evidence will come from the sites around you, which is what we see in Capital Volume 1 by Karl Marx, right? But that's not necessarily saying that that's being Eurocentric. Okay. Eurocentric is something else. It's about, creating a hierarchy. It's about valorizing a certain standpoint, a certain position at the cost of others. And we have to be careful enough to differentiate between the two positions. So if I just close, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of decolonization, but there are aspects which I'm more careful about.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Kushagra, do you want to open your mic?
Hi. First, I wanted to say one question, one comment, and one random joke is for me, Rohit's face was far more photogenic than any slide he would have put up. I've been meaning to look at his face for 10 years, and now I have finally succeeded. And on the question of decolonizing, I think we should really look at stuff that is happening in Delhi around the thing called the AQI and decolonizing of AQI, Air Quality Index. And now suddenly the Air Quality Index is a colonial object. And Delhi should have a different version of AQI from New York and London, apparently, because we respond to pollution differently in Delhi. So I'm very sympathetic to Rohit's point that we have to be very careful about what are the limits of decolonization and sort of where do we apply it to what end. I wanted to sort of make one comment to Rohit's ism and eality suffixes. And I think that one of the suffixes, Rohit made me read Anya Lumba's Colonialism, Post-Colonialism 10 years ago when I was in his consumer culture PhD course as an outsider back in IIM Calcutta. And I still remember one conversation that we had was this ization. I think I wanted to also add and quite ask Rohit, like, if the ism and eality hide something that the ization shows. And is the ism and the reality, the post-coloniality and post-colonialism, a little bit like Miller's finished objects? And the ization shows, an object still in the making, work in progress, in the sense that we are not at the end of colonialism, or we haven't yet seen the reality. It's like it's still unbound. It's still not. We haven't been able to put four walls around it and say, okay, now post-colonialism lives now in the Library of American Congress, and it will never escape from there. And final thing is second final question is, why is it that post-colonialization or post-colonial theory has failed so spectacularly, Rohit? Why do you think it has made almost no dent at all anywhere else except these, like, what Agamben would call exceptional places, right? These heterotopic places where some of us gather together and talk about it, and then it sort of dies a slow and painful death, or maybe not even slow and painful, but like, very spectacular, in an Evil Dead kind of way. And it nothing happens, and nobody cares, and like you said, memory and remembering and forgetting, right? Why is it so easy to forget? And sorry, I'm taking more time, but now I'm really like on a roll. So I will say one more thing is, I really loved your point about life and death, right? And in this classic semiotic square that we have been taught in semiotics courses, there used to be, the life and death, and then we built some kinds of oppositions. Uh, and what you said about the living dead made me remember the zombie in these beautiful semiotic squares always. But this is not the undead, right? The colonial object, and I won't even call it the subject, right? It's just the colonial object. It's a pure object. There is no agency, no subjectivity there, and therefore, to use your phrase, it's an ungrievable object, right? I remember you wrote a paper on the ungrievability of the maid, and it reminded me of that. That it's like this, the ungrievability of this thing that we cannot kill because it's already dead. You can't kill, therefore it's not worth mentioning it in 1918, because you can't kill something that is already dead. But it is not the undead in the way the zombie is an undead, right? Like, even the zombie gave us 5 series of The Walking Dead, but now the sort of colonial object didn't even give us a front page in Times of India. So what kind of undead, or is it the not the living dead, but the unalive that we are talking about? What kind of dead and alive are we talking about? And now I shut up.
Thank you so much, Kushagra. So wonderful to see you. Yes, it's been 10 years. It's very hard to, time has really passed.
Yes.
So thank you for your questions, Uh, Let me start with the first one, and help me if I lose track of some of your later questions. Let me start with the first one, your point about AQI in Delhi, Air Quality Index in Delhi, and how when you point to science in contemporary India, you are, possibly using a colonial category, right? That's the state that we've come to. If you read Meera Nanda's latest book, she very sharply points out how post-colonial theory is being appropriated by the Hindu far right, the Hindutva project today in India, to justify its project. And so, truly, the question of decolonization has to be very carefully handled, because in the name of rejecting the West, what we can do is it can give rise to all kinds of very reactionary tendencies, as we see in India today. And hence, I completely share your concern and your note of caution there. So, and I, Mirananda is a fantastic reference on this issue. Your second point about, Iti, ism and isation. So it is about a certain state, is a certain condition, right? When you use the suffix ity, it makes a noun which is about a certain condition. When you use the suffix ism, it creates a noun which is about theories or a way of explaining what we see. Isation I would say, creates, it's about how we create an outcome, right? Colonization, for instance, right? It's about creating an outcome. So the three are connected to each other. And I would say that it is not just in isation that we see a continuity. Both in ity and ism, we can see aspects of continuity. Post-coloniality can be an ongoing condition, a state of being, as much as post-colonialism can be an ongoing project of trying to understand or theorize the condition, the world that we inhabit today. So I don't quite see the difference that in the first two we see a pause, but in the third one we see an aspect of continuity. And help me to understand if I've somewhere got this wrong in terms of what your question was. But I do see continuities across these three, categories. Now, your third question about post-colonial theory not making a difference. My answer to that is yes and no. Yes, it hasn't made the kind of difference it should have. But the very fact, Kushagra, that I and you and all of us are having a conversation today on colonialism is a big step forward. And again, if I reflect over my own journey, when I started my PhD in 1998, we weren't really talking about colonialism in the discipline. Nobody was writing about colonialism. Forget about post-colonialism. Right? So the very fact that today we can talk about, we are having a conversation today, the very fact that University of Birmingham Business School has a project on decolonization, is a pointer in a certain direction. And the direction is that, yes, it has made a difference. Now, we all know that any of these moments of resistance are always appropriated. They're always, in a way, they end up becoming compromised. Those tendencies are there, those problems are there. And as some of us write about, a post-colonial theory or coloniality or decolonization, these very journals, which are otherwise colonial projects and part of the colonial epistemic project, gain greater legitimacy. So some can argue that what we are doing is, in the name of talking about post-colonial theory, we're also helping and furthering something that we are trying to write against. And those risks are there. Those risks of appropriation are always there. But I would still be, less pessimistic and say that, yes, it has made a difference. There's a greater consciousness about it. And there are more conversations that we see around us today. And hopefully it can make a difference. But its limitation is also because of some of its inability to talk about some of the comprehending laws, as I talked about. It tends to compartmentalize, it tends to create a very narrow focus on particularities without understanding these universals. And those are some of the limitations of post-colonial theory, which have also limited its appeal. Okay. Now, coming to your last point about is living dead different from a zombie? Yes, living dead is different from a zombie. Because zombie, in our understanding of this character is essentially is not seen as a victim, right? So for instance, we have somebody writing zombie capitalism, where the idea of a zombie is always a predator, an aggressor, right? When we talk about the living dead, as Bembe talks about, there's a clear understanding this living dead is the native, is the victim here. So I think there's a different position here in this relationship of violence when we talk about, say, a zombie versus a living, somebody who's considered a living dead. Okay. And that's where I would like to leave it. I'm sure this can go on, but that's where I would like to leave it.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much, sir.
Rohit. I just wanted to be fair on the questions and the orders they came. There is one on the chat. There are actually multiple on the chat. So I read one of them by Arindam. How is calypsology of caste and class in the consumerist post-colonial India different? And after that, Fatima, please open your mic. You will be the next one in line. Go ahead, Rohit, please.
Can you please repeat that, Zahra?
How is calypsology of caste and class in consumerist post-colonial India different?
Now, I'm not sure if my position is that the calypsology of class and caste are different. My position would be that class and caste coincide in the Indian context. And hence the two have to be seen together. But what is my larger point? My larger point is that in talking about the rest or the colonized or the native, there's a tendency in post-colonial theory to overlook these differences, to club different class positions, to club different caste positions. And when you club all these positions, what you don't acknowledge is the fact that there are these local circuits of exploitation and oppression. Right? What it does is it also overlooks the role of agency. You attribute too much to the colonial experience. For instance, think about the question of caste. Now, caste is not something which is created by British colonialism. It's something that Britishers inherit, and they, of course, use it. They channelize it for a certain purpose, as much as we see a very similar usage in contemporary India. But then that circuit of oppression or that hierarchy has to be understood, in order if we have to talk about the post-colonial condition, that we cannot universalize the entire experience. So that's my first position. Now, my second position is that on the question of exploitation, and that's where I bring in the idea of class, and we have to understand that oppression and exploitation are two different aspects. Exploitation is essentially extraction of surplus. It's an economic category, while oppression is a social category of how one group oppresses another social group. So when we start paying attention to the question of class, it's very evident that there is a certain class that benefits from colonialism. There was a class of big capitalists, big bourgeoisie in India that aligned with British capital, aligned with British colonialism and benefited from it. But was this the case with the underclasses, the working people? That's not true. Right? In the same manner, when I extend it over and cross over to the West, who were the prime beneficiaries of colonialism? Not an ordinary working class person. It's primarily a certain class which is benefiting from the surpluses that are being transferred from the South to the North. So hence, this is an aspect that has to be understood, and by overlooking it and conflating everything, we are making an error.
Go ahead, Fatima.
Thank you for the lovely workshop, Rohit. I just had one question. It's just basically echoing with what Bhatnagar has said, that a lot of time, the discussions around post-colonial theories tend to confine in a place. So sometimes it feels like, that in the literature, people borrow post-colonial theories to explain certain things rather than use it as a guiding force or a guiding theory. Because the workshop today was on post-colonialism and consumption. I just wanted to ask, where and how do you see post-colonial theories, for example, theories of Bhabha, Mishra, finding a place in marketing and consumption literature?
Thank you for that question. Now, I'm still trying to completely understand what you've asked me, and please correct me if there's some misunderstanding here. I do see some usage, some deployment of post-colonial theories. You gave the example of Homi Bhabha. You will see, writings which engage with this concept of mimicry, for instance. And ambivalence or hybridity. These are concepts which are picked up from Bhabha and frequently used in writings. And to that extent, they've influenced and shaped some of the writings. Now, is this really adequate? I would say, and I know possibly this is not a question that you've asked, but I would still like to respond. In my view, just focusing on some of these cultural aspects can be sometimes be misleading. It can be inadequate. Because think about, Bhabha's notion of mimicry, for instance, or ambivalence, for instance. What it does is it talks about this again. It goes back to my earlier response as well. It doesn't really understand or doesn't really unpack the layered nature of the Indian reality. Now, who's this entity who's trying to mimic? Who's this entity who becomes ambivalent? What is this entity that becomes ambivalent? What is the state of hybridity that we are talking about here? Without paying attention to, to the local hierarchies, to circuits of capital, to circuits of accumulation, can we really understand mimicry or, or a cultural category like hybridity in isolation? My answer to that is no. It's likely to lead to very misleading outcomes. And this is one of the key limitations of Homi Bhabha's writing. So again, I may not have completely answered your question, but help me to understand if there's something which I've missed out.
Unpack that. It's really important that we see Indian entity to understand how post-colonial hybridity is different from Homi Bhabha's default hybridity, because the Indian post-colonialism is just so different. It has so many layers. Thank you for saying that.
Thank you.
I'm reading another question from the chat. It's from Olivier. Thank you, Rohit. Really wonderful to hear. For me to hear someone like you with significant research and authority hammer down this point. Any view on what a different, more helpful approach to critical knowledge creation might concretely look like? I feel your point might apply to critical theory more broadly, by the way, but really nice to hear it expressed so clearly in the context of post-colonial debates.
Thank you for reading out that question, Zahra. It's a really broad question, and I don't know how one can answer it within the amount of time which is available. So I'll try to be brief here. In my view, the important part of being critical is to pay attention to the conditions of people who are marginalized. That for me is the most important test of a theory, is the most important test of a writing. Through your writings, are you able to give voice to people who are silenced? And that has to be at the heart of the critical project. For me also, you can't be critical if you're not really talking about capitalism as a system. It's, if I can repeat what Max Horkheimer famously said, that don't talk about fascism if you can't talk about capitalism. In the same manner, for me, if you want to really talk about critical theory, I would say let's talk about capitalism, and what it does and it's the impact and it has on people around us. So that's the second most important facet of being critical. The third important issue is, creating solidarities with people. When you talk about people who are traditionally silenced in our fields, then it's a way to create those solidarities. It's a way to be part of their struggles. And I know most of us are very privileged. We live in very privileged settings and so on and so forth. And yet, with our writings and with our research, we are constantly trying to transcend that, and we are trying to create this process of solidarity and writing to give voice to the voiceless. And here I don't really, and I know Gayatri Spivak has a point to make here about can the subaltern speak, and we can get into the question of the politics of representation here. But I would say that it's important to hear what subaltern and subordinated and the voiceless have to say, and to create that space on our pages and in our writings to give them that voice.
Thank you, Rohit. Two more questions, one from Naima. Can you please open your mic? Thank you.
Hi, Rohit. Thanks very much for the presentation. It was really insightful. So I'm a PhD scholar and I'm looking at the context of colorism and the skin lightening consumption in India. So when I started, I'm currently in my final year. So when I started, I had this idea coming that, some scholars discourage using the European theorist and, the white scholars' theories and stuff to analyze the very global South context on the grounds that it sort of reproduces the colonial epistemologies. So I was just wondering, could completely rejecting these theories also risk becoming a kind of very for decolonial stance, and if it also limits the theoretical engagement or assumes that theory itself can only come from the global north, how do you see this tension?
Thank you for that question. I partly answered it earlier. I'm very clear about it. This blanket rejection of Western theories is a highly reactionary moment. It's something which we should completely avoid. Because think about it. Think about what you've said. Whoever has told you this. Now, which is this authentic voice in the global South? Is it this upper caste, upper class, privileged academic who's going to speak on, somebody's behalf? Where do we stop this process? Who has the ability to speak on somebody's behalf? With this logic, it's basically a logic of silencing. It's a logic through which, we don't get to speak about real issues. It's a way to divert our attention from the real issues. And I would say this is a very dangerous tendency. I'm all for dialogues. I'm all for having a dialogue with, if you're writing about the question of colorism, if you're trying to write about the question of, caste, by all means, have an engagement with Romila Thappar's historical account of, the question of color, or, B.R. Ambedkar's writing on the question of caste, by all means. But then, are those the only authentic voices, or can we create a healthier dialogue between, say, some of these writings and the writings which exist from, say, people writing on Europe, of people writing on South America, people writing on Africa, other parts of the world?
I'm very conscious of time, so that's last question. Do you think the genocide in Gaza will change or make a difference to the post-colonial conversation in any way, or perhaps it is a new category of conversation?
It's an important question. I really don't have an answer to it. I do hope it changes the way we see the role of academy. I hope it helps us to see some of the fault lines as they exist in our disciplines. I hope it is able to identify the complicity of knowledge production in what we have seen in Gaza. You know, because unlike, see, the events of 1918, which I've described to you, where there could be an amnesia, where we could erase, we could not, those traces were removed. Gaza has unfolded in front of us on our television screens. We can't anymore say that we didn't see this, we didn't know about this. And to that extent, it's a very defining moment for all of us. Now, how the broader academy is going to respond to it is something which I'm not very clear about. But I do see it as a defining moment. I do see it as a very different kind of a moment as compared to some of the colonial experiences that I've just talked about.
Thank you so much. We all hope for that. It's the end of our workshop today. Thank you so much, Rohit. I can't thank you enough. I know it's very rare to see you in conferences, so that's amazing to see you here today and listen to you and learn from you. This is an ongoing conversation that we should have. And thank you for being part of it. And thank you for giving us honest, very context-driven and very detailed state of our conversation in coloniality, post-coloniality, and it's definitely an ongoing effort by all of you, all of us really. And I'm so glad to see so many PhD students taking on the sort of theoretical approach and continuing with this conversation. Rohit, something that is specific about you is that you talk about how different it was in 90s when you started doing this research to work on such a topic. And I'm really amazed to see that how you worked it out to be in this stage, your work method-wise, theory-wise, in all aspects, was not mainstream in any way. And you managed to publish in top-tier journals, books, amazing readership. So it's really great to see that you've paved the way really for all of us. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Zahra. It was a privilege, and my apologies again for not having the slides in place.
Thank you. Amazing work. And thank you very much. Thanks for all of
Thank
you
you
who
so much,
stayed
Rohit.
and very good questions.
Bye.
It was a fanboy moment for me.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Bye.